true, what's not, and how the hell did all this happen? That's what everyone who is watching Apple Cider Vinegar is asking each other and the internet right now, as a very Australian scammer story is smashing the Netflix charts right around the world.
Have you two finished it?
I haven't finished it yet. I think I'm about to go into episode 5.
I think I'm 3 episodes in, and Mia, you finished it, didn't you?
I inhaled it. I had a preview actually, so I was very excited for everybody to catch up so I can talk about it.
There will, obviously in this conversation, we will be talking about some of the things that have happened in the show. So if you're absolutely worried about spoilers, you might want to skip, but we're not really going into spoilers about the show. We're talking more about the story behind the story.
And the real lives of the people that it's based on. So it's sort of what's true and what's not.
Yes, because this 6-part drama is a fictionalised version of a story that many Australians know well. That's that in the early 20-teens, in the early days of blogs and Instagram, the so-called wellness warriors were in the ascendance. Primary among them, and well on her way to becoming a wealthy celebrity, was Belle Gibson, a young mother from Melbourne who had created an app called The Whole Pantry. And it was like an aesthetically pleasing collection of healthy recipes, very typical of the vibe of the time, very appetizing looking wellness bowls and smoothies and things.
Do you remember her at the time, Holly?
Very well. I remember this whole thing very well because we were all just beginning to be obsessed with Instagram. It also coincided with me coming to work on the internet, working at Mamamia around this time, and we were all very interested in this. The thing is that although the app looked really wholesome, like just healthy recipes, nice food, the backstory was not. So Belle sold this whole app and how great it was and the cookbook that came after and the awards that she won on the premise that changing her lifestyle to a healthy organic diet and various alternative treatment had cured her of brain cancer. So by 2014, she was winning awards and getting loads of money for publishing deals around the world, not just in Australia. And she had this massive groundbreaking partnership with Apple to be one of the only apps loaded onto the first version of the watch, the Apple Watch. So that's all true. That all happened, right? And then just 1 year later, so in 2015, 2 investigative reports in the Age newspaper began to pull at the strings that brought her undone. There was no proof that Gibson had ever had cancer. Promised charitable payments to children's charities and other cancer charities were never made. And the community of sufferers and survivors who'd found hope in her story were left devastated. 10 years and several court cases later, we have Apple Cider Vinegar, a high-production international hit that explores not just Gibson's story, but another famous wellness warrior's story, right? A woman called, in real life, she's called Jess Ainscough. In the show, she's called Miller. And just like in the show, she started off working in women's magazines. And Mia, Jess was in your orbit. Tell me a bit about your experiences around her.
She was. And there are a lot of tragic elements to this story and to this show, but this is perhaps most tragic. And I remember watching it happen in real time at the time. So Jess started blogging about her cancer. She had a type of cancer that began as lumps in her arm, and she was advised to have her arm amputated. I knew her because she'd worked in women's magazines. I'd left magazines by that time, but we moved in similar circles. We had a lot of people that we knew in common. And she chose to and it was quite controversial at the time, but she chose, and of course still would be now, but she chose not to have treatment, not to follow the suggestions of the doctors and have her arm amputated. And instead she decided to do something that is called in the show Hirsch therapy. In real life it's called Gerson therapy. And I had another friend who was going through cancer at the time, and she was more like the Lucy character in this. She was a doctor actually, but she was having Gerson therapy as well as having chemo and other sort of conventional medicine treatment, and Jess didn't. And she was blogging about this, the juices that she was having and the coffee enemas that she was having. So
Gerson therapy is about a more holistic approach. Is it about sort of eating and
start
health
using
broadly?
food to try and help your body cure itself. And it's predicated on the idea that conventional treatment is poison and your body knows how to get well, and you just have to have this very intensive regimen of fresh juices and coffee enemas, like 5 a day, and you have to juice all through the day. And
were coffee enemas at the time like quite taboo and unusual to hear someone talk about a coffee enema?
Yeah.
Because I see it everywhere now.
Well, people were having colonics back then, but having a coffee enema was like very specific, and this was something that you did at home. All of this sort of treatment, and what was interesting about it is that it combined, as Holly said, it was the beginning of Instagram, and Instagram loved beautiful women, beautiful young women. And so
and
it
a
was,
flat lay of fruit.
Yes, it was this lifestyle that was this beautiful. Jess was gorgeous. She lived by the beach in Queensland. She had this very sort of aspirational lifestyle, which is what the algorithm and Instagram was all about. And she had this seemingly fantastic story about using these natural remedies to cure herself, except she didn't cure herself, she died.
And so what actually happened to her in real life? Because in the show, she does for a period seem to heal herself, and then it reappears. Is that what happened in real life?
Yeah. So she had, because she had medical treatment, she agreed to have like a very minor procedure. And then she also, part of this treatment is not having scans. So you actually don't know. And as one of the characters in the show, her father says, but I don't understand if you're not, or her mother might actually say, if you're not having scans, how do you know if it's working or not? So it's.
And in the show, her mother gets cancer as well. Is that what happened in real life?
It is. And it was so tragic watching it happen in real time. And, you know, this is someone's cancer experience, and this was before sort of Twitter and before, Instagram was a pretty
positive
place. And there wasn't a lot of internet critique around that time, which is why probably Belle Gibson could get away with with her lies for so long. The tragedy was that Jess wasn't lying, and towards the end, as was portrayed, well, I don't want to sort of give away if you haven't watched, but it was just absolutely tragic to watch it unfold in real time. It was like watching a slow-moving car accident.
So she lived for 7 years, right, between the diagnosis and her death, and that's the period that's being portrayed in this show. And during that period is when she became famous, is probably the wrong word, but certainly in those circles, because to your question about coffee enemas and juicing and all those things of whether they were mainstream, they weren't mainstream, right? So there's always been lots of interesting alternative health therapies, and there's always been lots of interest in diet being related to medicine. But as Mia described it, the collision of those alternative therapies with Instagram at that particular moment, basically an unregulated Wild West space that really rewarded this aesthetic, spread it mainstream. And I guess the question of why is it interesting and why is it dangerous is because it pushed it out into the mainstream in a way that it wasn't before.
Yeah, because it made it all look very pretty. You know, it made cancer and wellness and natural remedies, it's a lot prettier than sitting in a hospital room with a cannula in your arm and getting chemo and having your hair fall out and all of those things. So people wanted to believe these stories, people with cancer and people without cancer. And I actually wasn't aware of Belle Gibson. You know, the show portrays that Belle was very much Jess came first. Like, Jess was famous, and you know, within certain circles, she was really well known. And the show depicts Belle noticing this and wanting to co-opt her story and seeing the interest and the attention she got and saying, wanting to monetize it as well.
What I've found fascinating is with the context of Baby Reindeer, with knowing that this is also a Netflix production, you can imagine that in the back of their minds as they are editing this, that Baby Reindeer is probably the shorthand for we have to be really careful, because obviously that was quite litigious. We spoke about it at length last year. That was the Netflix show that said that it was a true story. And then, of course, he represented his stalker who, had a striking resemblance to the real life stalker. And then in the show, there was a criminal case, but that hadn't happened in real life. And so that's where Netflix found themselves in a lot of trouble.
And they're still being sued, I think. I think she's going to win a lot of money for that. And the difference is, and it's interesting, when I watched this, I didn't realise that Emil Sherman, my cousin, was the producer. And so I called him up and I was like, how the baby reindeer of it all? Yeah. How did you do this? Because in Apple Cider Vinegar, some of the characters are fictionalized. Like, they don't call her Jess Ainscough, they call her Miller Blake, and yet they do call some characters the real thing. Like Belle Gibson is Belle Gibson, and her partner Clive is called Clive, and there's a publisher who published the book, or tried to, Julie Gibbs. That's her real name. So I was interested in that. And what happens at the beginning of every episode is that they have the character break the fourth wall. It's very effective, and say, this is a true-ish story. Belle Gibson was not paid for it, because that's the other thing. Nobody would want her to make money. So the reason that I asked why they fictionalized some, and the reason that they did that is because that then gave them a little bit more creative license. But, with certain things, they didn't have to be completely true to the story of some of those characters. And there was one character that was sort of pretty much invented, or an amalgam of people, which is the wife of one of the investigative journalists.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's in terms of how Jess's family would feel about it, I can't begin to imagine. Only her father is still alive. I believe she has a brother as well,
and
who's
she
not
has a
depicted. She had a fiancé who's just, of course, we went looking for him. He's remarried and is about to become a father, or just has become a father. But he posts, he's posted about Jess a lot. He hasn't said anything about this show.
It's because isn't there a risk that Belle will, because everybody wants to know what happened to Belle Gibson, right? If you look, People magazine in the US, or because everybody's watching this, everybody's obsessed. And where is Belle Gibson now is one of the hottest trending topics. Now, the answer to that question is nobody's really sure, because she kind of bubbled back up into consciousness a couple of years ago around some of the court cases about this. And at the time, it was rumoured that she was living in Melbourne and had kind of become involved in the Ethiopian community, and then that seemed like an interesting thing. And then no one was really sure. She's alleged to have separated from her partner, who's depicted in the show. But isn't there a chance, baby reindeer style, that she may come out?
So for her to come out, because I asked about this.
Not necessarily sue, but talk.
Yeah, I think that will happen.
Yep.
And I think that she'll be paid a lot of money. There's a lot of money for her to take if she decides to come out.
When you've been convicted in a court of law?
Sorry, she can't. I don't think she can sue, because to sue would have to. You can only sue for defamation, and to say that she was defamed, she'd have to prove that she really did have brain cancer.
I thought that to make money, I thought you couldn't make money off your crimes.
But it depends a little bit, because, there are technicalities there, because she's been fined for various things, but has she been convicted of a crime? Not necessarily. But anyway, that's a loophole.
Okay. Because she was paid for that 60 Minutes interview.
She was. But one of the things that I think is interesting, and why fictionalizing real people's lives is so fraught, is when I was watching this show, in the scenes where her character is depicted as a terrible mother, for example, and like locking her kid in his room and all those things, I found myself really defensive of her, which is ridiculous when you consider what she has done and the lives she has damaged. Because I was like, you don't know if she did that. How do you have any idea if she did that? And if that was me and I was sitting in my hiding corner somewhere, there would probably be plenty in this that would make me want to go, I want to come out, especially if I was a sociopath.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
And interestingly, early in the series, particularly, I have found myself empathising with her and seeing her relationship with her mother, how she was an outcast, her upbringing, and sort of not understanding. There was a great quote from the writer who said that basically you can empathise without absolving.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in that way, there is a scene. This is the number one thing I've Googled up until where I've watched, which is whether she lost a baby, which feels like the most awful thing to Google, right? Because how horrific that you would ask if that was true.
She's spoken about having a miscarriage, but what the show portrays is that she had a very late miscarriage and the baby was stillborn.
At 24 weeks. But then, of course, you've set this character up who is a pathological liar, who uses her health to, make money. And we see her kind of that narrative is part of what sells her products. And so,
but I think that's what's challenging about it and what makes it just one of the best shows I've watched, I think, ever, is when it was depicting her having that ultrasound, I was expecting there to be no baby. So that we often say two things can be true. She can be a compulsive liar, but also there can be damage. Like some of her stories were true, like perhaps her mother, perhaps she did lose a baby. Yeah. It's unclear. But
and I don't think it's as simple as this one note villain, because I think that there must be, and I remember thinking this with the 60 Minutes interview, which is one of the most compelling, bizarre things I've ever watched.
And no one's been able to wear a pink turtleneck jumper since then.
No one's really wanted to. But I remember watching that and thinking, that is a woman in pain. Like something has happened. You don't get to that point without having experienced something.
So the reason, back to your question about will she come out, the reason why I actually think she probably won't is she's a shapeshifter. I think we can't make diagnoses, but she clearly has a very complicated relationship with reality and the truth. And what we saw in that 60 Minutes interview and what we see through the show is this portrayal that she can't cope when she's confronted by the truth. She's slippery. So to come out, I don't think she's going to be like, so I did make it up and here's what happened. Like even in that 60 Minutes interview, she kept maintaining, no, there was this doctor and he put a box under my chair and I did think I had cancer. She's so slippery. So I don't think she will come out. Will she end up on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here or Dancing with the Stars? Maybe.
My gosh, I wonder. I also think what this show does very well is presents the complexity of these issues because, through the fictionalized character of Lucy, through Miller's experiences, you absolutely understand and wrestle with these really chunky issues about, well, who does get to decide what happens to your body when you are this sick? What does it feel like to watch somebody that you love suffering so much? How do you make those decisions? And I find all those questions just so interesting to grapple with, and it doesn't kind of airbrush over them or make them seem easy or binary in any way.
I think what was different with Jess is that there's her choices, which is one thing, but she was very evangelical.
Yeah.
She was very urging people, and is depicted in the show, including people in her family, to adopt these same messages. And she was spreading the word. She thought she was doing the right thing. Tragically, she wasn't.